The first thing I remember is the color a sheet of weather-faded blue snagged under a mat of sword ferns 30 yards off a thinning line of pines. The logger stood back with his saw quieted, and the woods settled into that held breath you only hear when the mountains want you to listen. In the hush, I brushed pine duff from a strip of bark and saw 2 names scratched there with something blunt. Careful letters turned pale with time. Let me know where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. On most mornings back then, Cedar Ridge woke up slow. Trucks rolled past my storefront around 6:30 breaks, tapping at the single stoplight by the diner. You could smell bacon fat drifting down from the vent hood and hear the newspaper boxes rattle when the delivery kid kicked them straight. Summers ran warm but mild. If the sun cleared the foothills by 8, we knew we'd get a decent 78 degrees by afternoon. I opened the hardware at 7 sharp, same as my father did before me door chime coffee, on lights humming to life in aisle 3. Michael Hartman would swing by on Fridays when his first shift ended, early eyes a little tired tie loosened a clipboard tucked under his arm from habit. He worked claims out of a small office near the river, the kind of job where you're always hearing about the worst day in someone else's life. He handled it with a tidy sort of patience, kept a pen in his shirt pocket, and a spare tucked inside his wallet, because you never know. He and I met years earlier when a windstorm peeled shingles off half the neighborhood. He showed up at my driveway with a box of roofing nails and that steady smile of his saying, "Figure you'll need these before noon." His boy Connor stocked shelves for me that last summer, string trimmer line birdseed boxes of deck screws heavy enough to make his shoulders sag if he stacked too many at once. He grew fast in August, one of those teenage spurts that suddenly make a kid's jeans too short. He cracked jokes under his breath, kept earbuds looped in his collar even when he wasn't listening to anything, and asked me about Washington State's engineering program when the lunch crowd thinned and the store got quiet. He was quick with customers. Older men liked him because he'd carry cinder blocks without making a show of it. Michael and Sarah split years earlier, gentle as those things go. They never spoke harshly in public, and they traded weekends like neighbors trading casseroles. If there was a tense moment, it didn't show. Sarah worked mornings at the elementary school, the kind of person who kept Band-Aids in her purse and snacks in a glove box for kids who forgot breakfast. My wife Linda knew her through church. They traded recipes and PTO sign-up sheets over a picnic table at the park while we old guys argued about the Mariners. The weekend that matters started ordinary. Saturday's farmer's market popped up in the courthouse lot, sweet corn stacked in wire baskets, a fiddler sawing gentle tunes under the poplar tree, kids weaving between stalls with snow cones that stained their tongues neon blue. Michael had the right edge of a plan. He always did. He'd been talking for months about a short trip into the Cascades, one of those father-son resets you talk about and never schedule. When he told me Tuesday in aisle 5, he looked embarrassed by how excited he was. 4 days, he said. Just us, Ray. A little fishing, some old game trails I used to know. No distractions. I sold him stove fuel and a fresh water filter, then talked him out of the bargain flashlight he'd picked. Take the one with a rubber gasket, I said, and the extra O-ring. You'll thank me in the rain. He grinned, the polite kind of grin he used when he already knew I was right. Connor showed up later that afternoon and leaned across the counter like a kid trying to look older. "Do we really need paper maps?" he asked. "Dad's got a compass. I've got my phone." I slid a folded topo across the counter anyway and circled the creek crossings with a red pencil. "Phones break," I said. "Gravity doesn't care about your data plan." He laughed at that because 18 feels like the age when gravity ought to pick on somebody else. Cedar Ridge believed in routine. We measured time by holiday parades, and the first day the high country snow melted back from the logging roads. When the weather held, folks stretched their evenings. After dinner, I'd water the tomatoes, listen to the huff of a lawnmower down the block, and watch porch lights wink on as sunset drifted late behind the firs. Michael would jog the cul-de-sac at a steady pace, 2 loops, hand lifted in a tired salute as he passed. Connor sometimes rolled a basketball at his feet to trip him just enough to make his dad laugh and swat the ball away without breaking stride. It was their rhythm teasing, then quiet, then the shared clatter of dishes being done. On the Thursday before they left, Deputy Mike Anders ran SAR drills at the Fairgrounds Basic Compass Work Short Litter Carries, a rope system for an embankment scenario. I do those trainings because small counties lean on volunteers. We're flat out when a call comes. Mike's a good teacher, young enough to still run, old enough to listen. He dragged a boot across the dust and drew a quick lesson on terrain shadows, how a north-facing slope chills earlier and holds a smell longer. Later, over coffee from a thermos, I swear could strip paint. He asked whether I'd seen Michael lately. "He's taken the kid up past the Forks," Mike said. "Good time of year, cool nights, clear mornings. Friday came easy. I cut keys, mixed paint, and argued with an old friend about whether the Hawks had a shot this season. Michael swung in near lunch with a list. His handwriting ran straight as fence posts. He bought fuel duct tape, a field knife, and those instant oatmeal packets nobody likes but everybody buys. He turned the knife over in his hand like he was memorizing the weight. "This is overkill," he said. "We're not trekking to Alaska." "Overkill lives in the glove box," I told him. "And it's only overkill until it isn't." He tucked the receipt into his wallet, neat as always. They pulled out Saturday mid-morning in a silver Honda that had seen better shocks but still made the mountain grades. Connor hung his arm out the window and drummed the door with his fingers. They waved, both of them wide and honest. Linda and I were trimming the lilac hedge. "2 boys on an adventure," she said, and I nodded. The air smelled like cut grass, and the first heat of late summer laid low across the street. They took the county road that skirts the river, then the highway north, then, if Michael still favored the old ways, one of those logging spurs studded with rock where the trees knit over the hood and the radio turns to fuzz. Sunday mornings in Cedar Ridge move on rails. I open late after church while the diner fills with a second wave. The cook stands in the window and flips pancakes as easy as cards. Sarah slipped in for a coffee to go, hair pinned up in a neat clip, a cardigan over her shoulders, even though it was warm. She told Linda the same thing she always said when it was Michael's weekend. "He's got a schedule. He'll have Connor back in time for homework." She smiled when she said it, the way you smile at a promise you've tested enough times to trust. I checked the mountain forecast on the wall calendar we kept behind the counter, a habit left over from the year the snow came early and trapped a couple-day hikers in a ravine. The numbers looked friendly high 70s, a dip into the low 50s after dark, a whisper of wind. Up high, the mornings would start crisp with that clean pine smell that makes you breathe deeper. If there's a perfect time to be in the Cascades, early September lays a strong claim. Monday brought the small stuff bolt bins to refill a shattered rake handle to replace a stubborn sump pump to special order for a rancher whose basement liked to flood on principle. The school speed zones lit their yellow strobes again, and kids tried to remember who sat where on the bus. By lunchtime, the town had shifted back into weekday pace delivery trucks, thumping over the expansion joints on Main, a mail carrier, whistling a tune I couldn't place, and the bell at my door giving that soft clank when somebody with work boots came in. About 2 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed with a number I knew by heart. Sarah. She was cheerful at first, the kind of cheerful you use to keep the edges smooth. "You seen the boys?" she asked. I told her no, but I'd keep an eye out for the Honda, just in case they'd decided to surprise Connor's grandmother with a visit on the way home. She laughed and said I was romanticizing. "Michael's not the detour type," she said. We hung up. I went back to counting copper fittings, and she drove toward the grocery store to pick up a few things for dinner, a habit she kept when it was Connor's night at her place, making sure there was extra food in case he brought a friend. 3 o'clock came and went. The day held that pleasant lull you get in dry weather when the town breathes easy. I swatted a fly out of the doorway and thought about closing a few minutes early. Around 4, Linda called from home. "Did you hear from Sarah?" she asked. I said no, not since earlier. She called me too, Linda said. Not worried, just checking. I told her I'd swing by on my way home just to say hello and put her mind at ease the way neighbors do with words and the presence to back them up. On my last aisle walk, I noticed the topo map still laid out behind the counter where I'd shown Connor the creek crossings. My red pencil had rolled into the crease. I slid it into the drawer and told myself that a good trip always runs long. The mountains aren't a place you rush. Dusk in Cedar Ridge isn't dramatic. It folds down gently like a quilt pulled over your knees. Porch lights winked on one by one. I locked the front door, flipped the open sign to closed, and stood for a second in the calm. Then I heard it, the long ring of the shop phone in the quiet. I let it buzz once more, then reached for it slowly as if moving fast might break something I couldn't repair. On the drive home, I passed Sarah's house. The living room lamp was on shade, tilted just so, that warm circle of light we all keep by habit. Her porch light burned too brighter than usual, luring moths that tapped the glass in soft, aimless patterns. I eased off the gas, meaning to stop, then thought better of it. Some evenings need to belong to the people inside. Back at my place, I set my keys in the dish and listened to the house settle refrigerator motor water heater tick the dog's nails, clicking the kitchen linoleum. Linda stood at the sink with a dish towel, watching the road through the gap in the curtains. "He's punctual," she said, almost to herself. I nodded the way you do when you don't want to set a worry on its feet. We kept the television low. The dog sighed and lay down by the door. A breeze slid in off the foothills, after 9 cool as a creek. Somewhere down the block, a screen door creaked and thumped shut. I stepped onto the porch and leaned against the rail, the paint smooth under my palm, the air a clean pine and dust mix that always made me think of Little League and new cedar fencing. The street lay quiet, a long, dark ribbon with one way in and one way out, and every house we knew by heart, who owned the boat, who still put wind chimes under the eaves, who kept Christmas lights up longer than they should. 10 o'clock came, then 1:30. The big hand on my wristwatch slid to the top with an easy click I'd heard 1,000 nights. Somewhere, a coyote yipped one call, short and far off. I told myself the same story I always told traffic held them, or they'd stopped for pie at the diner, where the waitress knows everybody's name. Inside, Linda turned the porch light a notch brighter the way you do when you're guiding someone home from farther away than you planned. We stood there a moment longer than felt natural, watching the empty curve of the street and the soft square of light on Sarah's porch, 2 houses over, glowing like a promise you expect to be kept. Then we went inside and left our own porch light burning just a little too bright, just a little too long. I remember that Sunday night air as something heavy, the kind that sits low to the ground and makes the world feel smaller. The porch light hummed against the quiet, the bugs tapping the glass like tiny clocks counting time no one could see. Linda had gone inside, but I stayed on the steps with a cup of coffee, gone cold watching the curve of the street that led toward the highway. The Hartmans should have been back by then. Michael was predictable almost to a fault. If he said he'd be home at 8, you could set your watch by it. When 10 came and went, that little thread of unease we'd ignored all evening started to pull tight. Around 11, my phone buzzed on the railing. Sarah's number lit up. Her voice was soft, but frayed at the edges. "Ray, have you heard anything?" she asked. I told her no, maybe they'd stopped somewhere or lost service. She said she'd already tried calling 6 times voicemail every time. She laughed once, a hollow sound meant to hide the panic creeping in, and said, "He probably forgot to charge it again." We both knew that wasn't true. By morning, she'd called me again earlier than I expected. The sun wasn't up yet. "They're not back," she said. Her tone had shifted. There wasn't panic in it anymore, just a kind of clarity that comes when denial gives up. I promised to head to the sheriff's office first thing. When I got there, the air still smelled like floor polish and burnt coffee. Deputy Anders was already in eyes bleary from a long shift. He looked up when I walked in. "Morning, Ray. You hear something?" I shook my head. "It's the Hartmans," I said. "They didn't come back yesterday." That was enough for him to stand up. We'd both been through enough missing person calls to know the window for easy answers closes fast. By mid-morning, Sarah had filed the report, her hands shaking as she slid the photo of Michael and Connor across the counter. Mike assured her they'd get started right away. But even as he said it, we both knew how many square miles of forest those words could mean. The first hours were hopeful. Mike coordinated with search and rescue to send out a few local volunteers to check the main access roads, guys who knew which gates were unlocked, which roads washed out after rain. I joined them. We drove the back route toward Glacier Road, passing those same dense stands of cedar and fir that rise like walls on either side of the gravel. The morning light came in stripes through the trees, too bright where it hit the dust, too dark everywhere else. I remember thinking how easy it was for a car to disappear up here, one wrong turn, one fallen log, and you'd never see it from the air. We found the Civic around lunchtime, tucked off a turnout near the trailhead Michael had mentioned weeks earlier. The tires were clean, meaning it hadn't been driven in days. He'd parked it neatly straight between the brush lines like he always did. The doors were unlocked. Inside, the seats were spotless, no struggle, no mess, just the faint scent of pine and old coffee. The keys were still in the ignition. Connor's duffel sat in the back seat, neatly folded clothes, inside tags still on a new flannel shirt Sarah had bought him for the trip. On the dashboard was one of Michael's checklists, every box marked with his precise handwriting. He'd planned this trip down to the last meal. Everything about it said order, not accident. We radioed the find back to base. Within an hour, the first canine team arrived. I stood back as the handlers opened the back of their trucks, letting the dogs leap down with that eager tension they carry before a track. The air had warmed to the high 70s by then, and the smell of sap was sharp enough to sting. The dogs picked up the scent, fast, noses, low tails, sweeping. They moved along a faint path leading into the woods. We followed single file, the brush catching our pant legs. About 2 miles in the air changed cooler, denser, with that stillness that means you've crossed into old growth. The trunks here were massive, some 8 feet around the canopy, blotting out the sun. The dogs kept on for another mile, steady and sure, until we hit a ravine where moss grew thick as carpet. There they stopped. One of them circled, whining nose high, then low again. The handler frowned, tried another direction. The dogs wandered in small loops, then sat down. "They've lost it," he said quietly. It didn't make sense. No weather, no rain, no reason for the scent to just end. We marked the spot with tape and called for additional units. The rest of the afternoon blurred into the sounds of helicopter rotors and radio chatter, men's boots crunching over dead branches. From above, the forest looked endless. I'd seen maps of that area my whole life, but standing under those trees, you realize how little space a human footprint takes up. They brought in thermal scanners that night, but the canopy was too thick for heat signatures to penetrate. From the air, it all looked the same, green shadows swallowing whatever light touched them. Sarah drove up to the base camp the next morning. She was pale, running on coffee and hope. She thanked every volunteer she passed, her voice steady but small. I walked her to the command tent. Inside, maps were spread across folding tables, lines of red tape showing search grids. Mike briefed her on the situation. He didn't lie. He said the terrain was brutal, visibility poor, but they were expanding the radius. She listened, nodded once, then asked one question. "You've done this before. What do you really think?" Mike hesitated, then said, "We're still early, ma'am. Sometimes they walk out on their own." She looked down at her hands and said, "Michael's not one to get lost." The days that followed ran together. We searched 12 hours a day, sometimes more. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the ridges, dipping low into valleys when fuel allowed. Volunteers combed creeks and slopes in pairs, calling names into silence that never answered back. Evenings were the hardest when the noise of effort gave way to the stillness of the mountain. You'd sit by a fire watching smoke twist into the branches and wonder where they'd gone after the trail vanished. The official search stretched through that first week, and every night, Sarah stayed at a small roadside inn 20 miles from base sleeping little. She'd rise before dawn, drive to the command post, and start over. By the end of the second week, the official operation scaled down. That's the part no one prepares you for the moment the radios go quiet and the trucks stop coming. The sheriff met with Sarah, explaining resources, probabilities, the limits no one wants to hear. I watched her listen, her face unreadable. When they finished, she thanked him for everything, then walked out to her car without saying another word. The next morning, she was back alone with a borrowed map and a second-hand pair of hiking boots. She said she wasn't giving up, and she meant it. Over the months that followed, she organized her own searches. Some weekends it was half a dozen friends, other times just her and a pair of locals with tracking experience. She studied the land like it was a language, learning to read the breaks in branches, the patterns in moss growth, the way wind carries sound in the valleys. I joined when I could. There was a stubbornness in her that reminded me of Michael's precision. It wasn't denial. It was duty. She believed if she stopped looking, the forest would win. Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the ridge tops by October. When the last volunteer left, Sarah kept going. She'd call sometimes from a payphone near the ranger station, voice low, saying she'd found an old boot print or a torn tarp. Every clue led nowhere, but she never spoke of it like failure, just another corner turned. Eventually, her job cut her hours. Her friends stopped asking how she was holding up. People in town started using the past tense when they spoke about Michael and Connor, but Sarah never did. The years dulled the noise, but not the ache. By the 5th anniversary, the case had faded into that quiet corner of local lore where stories of loss settle. Parents used it as a warning to new hikers: stay on the trail, sign the log, carry a radio. But for Sarah, time only deepened the question. She told me once while tracing a route on a map under the harsh light of her porch, "If they were gone, I'd feel it. You can tell when someone you love stops breathing." I didn't argue. Some things you don't measure by reason. 15 years later, the call came. It was a weekday morning, early spring. The kind of day when mist clings to the ground and everything smells like wet bark. I was fixing a lock on the front door of the hardware store when the phone rang. A man's voice on the line, Jake Morrison, a logger from the province up north. He sounded shaken breath, uneven, like he'd been running. "You remember that case," he said. "The father and son who went missing near Whistler." I think I just found where they were. The room tilted a little. I leaned against the counter. "What did you find?" I asked. There was a pause on his end, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone flat, as if he was describing something too large for words. "A camp," he said. "Old, but not empty. You'll want to see it." That night, as I locked up, the air outside felt too still. Streetlights glowed against the damp pavement, and the town's only neon sign hummed by the diner window. I stood there for a long time, the key still in the lock, thinking about the years that had passed, and the ones that never really had. Somewhere out in those woods beyond where the roads gave up, someone had finally found a piece of what we'd lost. I didn't know yet what it meant, or how much darker the truth might be. But I knew this much: the mountains don't forget. They just wait for the right moment to speak. When Jake Morrison called, I didn't believe him at first. You hear so many false starts in cases like this, hunters finding old gear hikers swearing they saw a shelter in the woods, but his voice carried a kind of weight I couldn't ignore. He said he'd been logging north of Whistler, cutting through an older section of forest that hadn't been touched in decades. He'd noticed something bright, something that didn't belong, blue fabric under layers of moss and debris. He thought it might be trash at first until he got close enough to see it was part of a tent still half standing after all these years. The name Hartman wasn't mentioned yet, but I could feel it in his silence. After a moment, he said quietly, "There's writing on the bark beside it. 2 names. Looks like they'd been here a long time." I drove up the next morning. The sky hung low and gray, the kind of cloud cover that never burns off, just settles heavier through the day. Jake met me at the gate where the logging road turned from gravel to mud. He was older than I'd imagined, deep lines, hands thick with callus, that kind of stillness men get after years in the woods. He climbed into my truck and we rode the rest of the way without much talk. When we reached the clearing, he killed the engine of his own machine and just pointed. "There," he said. "About 200 yards in." The forest swallowed us quick. Underfoot the ground was soft and uneven, layered with needles that muffled every step. The air smelled of wet bark and iron-rich soil. When we finally broke through a line of young alder, I saw it. The tent slumped under the weight of its own decay. The nylon faded to a pale, ghostly blue. Time had nearly erased it, but it was still recognizable. Around it, the remains of a camp stretched outward like a map of decisions. A fire ring built with precision stones stacked to form a windbreak. Food tins strung high on branches by old cords still holding against the elements. Everything was too deliberate to be casual, too lived in to be temporary. Jake stood beside me, hands on his hips. "It's old," he said softly. "But not that old." I crouched near the tent, brushing away needles until I could see the ground cloth beneath. It was layered thick with ash from old fires. Whoever had been here knew what they were doing. They'd survived for a long time. Then I noticed something carved into the bark of a nearby tree, letters faint but careful. Michael. Under it another. Connor. My throat went dry. For 15 years we'd had nothing, no trace, no closure. And now 2 names carved into living wood holding their place against weather and time. I called Deputy Anders first. His line clicked and cracked through spotty service, but when he heard what I said, his voice changed instantly. "Don't touch anything," he told me. "We're coming up." He reached out to the provincial authorities, and by evening the site was crawling with people. RCMP officers, forensic techs, search and rescue veterans who'd long since retired but came anyway. Yellow tape cut through the trees, marking off the space like a wound reopened. Detective Maria Santos arrived not long after. I hadn't seen her since the first months of the search, back when she was a young investigator still trying to prove herself. She'd aged like the rest of us. Her hair shorter, her voice quieter, but she still carried that same steady focus. She stood at the edge of the clearing, taking it all in before stepping closer. 15 years, she said, and it's still here. The work went slow, as it should. Every fragment was photographed, cataloged, numbered. A tarp was strung to protect the site from drizzle. Near the tent, one of the forensics techs uncovered a small cache buried in the soil, a waterproof container, old but intact. When they pried it open, I caught the smell of paper preserved by time. Inside were identification cards for both Michael and Connor. Beneath those, wrapped in what used to be a plastic bag, was a leather-bound notebook, edges curled and darkened. Santos didn't read it there, not at first. She sat on a folding chair under the tarp while the techs continued their work, turning the pages carefully with gloved hands. I could see her eyes move line by line, her expression shifting from concentration to disbelief. Later, she walked over to me, holding the notebook close like something fragile. "It's his handwriting," she said. "Michael kept a journal. 3 years' worth." That night after the teams packed up, we stayed behind with a small crew to make sure the site remained secure. Santos sat by the truck's headlight beam, reading sections aloud. The early entries were ordinary dates, routes, weather. He wrote about the day they got lost, the initial confusion when the familiar landmarks didn't line up, how he'd tried to hide his worry from Connor. Then the entries shifted to survival, how they rationed food, found water, built shelter. He described the camp in detail, the improvements over time, their routines. They'd been alive much longer than anyone had imagined. Months, maybe years. But the tone changed somewhere in the middle. The entries grew strained, scattered with references that didn't fit the practical tone of the rest. One note read, "We saw lights last night, no flash, no sound, just movement between the trees." Another mentioned hearing footsteps circling their camp after dark, though nothing was taken. "Connor says they're watching us," he wrote. "I told him it's just the wind." I remember feeling a chill, not from the air, but from the way those words settled in my chest. Out there in the deep woods, reality has a way of bending. Isolation strips away the boundaries between what's seen and what's felt. I've heard seasoned rangers talk about it, how the silence gets inside your head, how you start to feel the land breathing with you. Still, something in those entries didn't read like hallucination. They were too measured, too consistent. One of the forensic specialists, Dr. Walsh, joined us later that week. She was an anthropologist from Vancouver, a quiet woman with a calm precision that reminded me of Michael himself. After studying the site, she told us there was evidence of multiple occupants over time. Different layers of ash in the fire ring, different tool marks on the wood. This place wasn't used once, she said. It was used many times. That realization hung heavy in the air. If Michael and Connor weren't alone, who else had lived there? And when Santos and I sat by the trucks later watching the last of the light fade behind the ridge. He wrote that the forest felt alive, she said, like it was watching them. You think that's just what happens when someone's been out there too long? I didn't answer right away. After 15 years of not knowing, I'd stopped trying to explain what the wilderness can do to a person. Instead, I told her what Sarah once said, that some places hold people longer than they mean to. A few days later, a team found another camp not far from the first. Older, smaller, half buried under moss. It looked similar in design, as if someone had followed the same pattern years before. The logs were cut with hand tools, not modern blades. Inside, they found scraps of fabric, fragments of bone, too weathered to identify on sight. Walsh took samples for testing. She said the layering of human activity in that valley went back decades, maybe longer. It was as if people had been coming there one after another and vanishing into the same silence. Back at the main site, the journal's final pages grew erratic. The handwriting wavered, words, slanted sentences broke off mid-thought. Michael wrote of Connor changing, of him hearing voices in the wind of a pull he couldn't explain. The last entry was dated months after the one before it. "Connor is gone," it read. He walked into the forest like it was home. Then one final note. "I think I understand now." That line stayed with me for days. I thought of Sarah, how she'd stood by her porch light for hours that night, waiting for headlights that never came. I thought of all the people who've gone missing in those mountains since the search teams, the families still waiting. Every time we blame terrain, weather, bad luck. But this felt different. This felt deliberate, like something bigger than mistake or chance. As the investigation widened, more camps turned up. Some newer, others ancient. The forest had been shelter to more than just the Hartmans. It had been home to generations of people who disappeared from the maps, but not from the earth. The RCMP called it a pattern of long-term habitation. Locals started calling it the Hollow. The name fit. It wasn't just a place. It was a presence, a kind of gravity that drew certain people in and never let them go. When we finally packed up to leave the site that last evening, the air was still and colorless. The tape came down, the generators shut off, and for a moment the clearing looked exactly as it had before Jake's chainsaw bit the earth, a place too quiet, too ordinary to hold so much loss. I stood there longer than I meant to, watching mist drift through the trees, and caught myself listening for something. A voice, a footstep, a whisper. Nothing came. just the soft hiss of wind through cedar branches, steady and endless. Driving back down the mountain, I saw the reflection of the tape lights fade in the rearview mirror. The forest closed in behind me, sealing the road with shadow. And, for the first time since we found that camp, I realized something that chilled me deeper than any discovery could. We hadn't uncovered the end of the story. We'd just found where it started to breathe again. For weeks after we found the Hartman camp, I couldn't sleep right. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that blue fabric faded, torn, and half buried in moss staring back at me like a question that didn't want to be answered. The search area was officially closed off now, cordoned under the authority of half a dozen agencies. But for those of us who'd been there that first day, the mountain hadn't really let us go. The smell of that campfire ash clung to my clothes longer than it should have. I could still feel the strange quiet that hung in that clearing, like the air itself had been listening for too long and didn't know how to stop. Detective Santos and her partner Ryan Park stayed on site through early spring. They ran every test they could: soil samples, DNA swabs, tool impressions. Every answer only raised more questions. Dr. Walsh's team uncovered more evidence near the perimeter: a cooking pit, stacked stones arranged in deliberate lines, even a few sharpened sticks bound with metal wire. She said it looked like long-term habitation, but not just by the same people. The camp had layers, she said. Eras of human presence, each one erasing traces of the last. I didn't know what to make of that. None of us did. What stuck with me most wasn't the physical remains, though. It was that notebook. Santos had it transcribed page by page into a digital file for analysis. I was allowed to read portions of it at her request, partly because I'd known Michael personally, partly because she wanted another pair of eyes on it. The first entries were measured like the Michael I remembered: practical, neat, sometimes hopeful. Then, little by little, the tone warped. The sentences shortened. He wrote about the forest differently, less as a place and more like a living thing that was learning them, studying them. He wrote about hearing whispering from nowhere about movement just beyond the reach of their firelight. His words shifted from we to I, from finding food to being found. Somewhere in the middle of those pages, the man I'd known disappeared into someone I couldn't recognize. One afternoon, I joined Santos by the evidence tent. She was reading the journal again, head bent under the weak light. "There's something about this," she said quietly. "It's not just fear. It's transformation." Like he was watching himself change and couldn't stop it. She closed the book and set it gently on the table. "He writes about the others, plural. You think that means people?" I hesitated, not sure if she wanted an answer or silence. "Could be," I said. "Could also be the mountain itself. You stay out there long enough, you start to think it's got eyes." She didn't laugh, just nodded once and went back to her notes. A week later, the forensics team expanded their dig radius. That's when they uncovered the cache, a small pit covered with bark and stones hidden behind a thick stump. Inside were remnants of food storage and what looked like scavenged metal fashioned into cutting tools. Nearby, under a collapsed section of soil, they found a second makeshift shelter, smaller, rougher, built of rotted branches bound with wire. It hadn't been built by Michael. The tool marks didn't match. The nails and bindings were older. Dr. Walsh brought over a piece of fabric she'd pulled from the soil. It was part of a tent, a style discontinued years before Michael's trip. Whoever made this, she said, was here long before him. The implications sat between us like fog. If the Hartmans had stumbled into a place already occupied, then what had they really found out there? I asked Jake the logger to walk me back to the site later that evening. The official crews had packed up for the day, and dusk was sliding through the trees in streaks of gray. We didn't speak much, just listened to the sound of our boots on damp leaves. When we reached the clearing, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Along the far ridge, about 20 yards from the fire pit, was a faint trail almost hidden by regrowth, but still there. It led uphill, curving between boulders toward denser timber. Jake said he hadn't noticed it earlier. We followed it for a short way, stopping when the light thinned too much to see clearly. The ground was disturbed small depressions where someone had knelt or worked the soil. Then Jake pointed. Embedded in a fallen log was a rusted tin plate, bent and scorched black on one edge. Scratched into the surface were faint marks, lines, almost letters. We couldn't make them out. Back at base camp, Santos listened carefully but didn't jump to conclusions. "We'll get a team on it in the morning," she said. No sense chasing ghosts in the dark. But her eyes told a different story. She wasn't sleeping well either. The next morning, the excavation expanded again. Within hours, they found remnants of yet another camp farther up the slope. Older still. The fire ring was overgrown, its stones half sunk into the earth. Inside, they found animal bones, stripped clean fragments of metal, and a single bullet casing too corroded for a clear read. It wasn't from Michael's time, that much they knew. Walsh said the pattern of habitation suggested the area had been used repeatedly for decades. Each group that came after built on what was left before recycling tools, repairing shelters, leaving traces layered like sediment. "It's almost like a community," she said softly, except one that never existed at the same time. By now, the story had leaked. Reporters camped at the base of the access road hoping for statements. The headlines talked about the Hartman encampment and the Hidden Valley mystery. None of them knew how quiet that place really was, how it swallowed sound, how it made your own heartbeat feel too loud. When the final results from the lab came back, things got stranger still. The DNA from hair strands recovered at the site confirmed 2 distinct individuals matching Michael and Connor. But there were additional traces, 2 other human profiles that didn't match anyone in existing databases. Partial degraded, impossible to date precisely. Walsh's voice shook slightly as she presented the findings to Santos. "They're human," she said, "but I can't tell you from when." That night I sat outside the temporary field office with a mug of black coffee gone cold. Santos joined me, her coat buttoned up to the neck. She looked tired in the way people do when they've been staring at the same mystery for too long. "He survived Ray," she said after a while. "Longer than anyone thought possible. But whatever happened after, I don't think it was simple." She pulled a small notebook from her pocket and flipped it open. This was written 3 days before the last entry in the journal. She handed it to me. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "Connor hears them. I try not to. The forest has a pulse." I read it twice, then handed it back. The night around us was still, save for the faint hum of generators. "You think he was losing his mind?" I asked. She closed the notebook. "Maybe. Or maybe he was just seeing something we don't have words for." In the following weeks, the investigation spread beyond the campsite. Teams scoured nearby valleys, ridges, and old mining trails searching for additional evidence. They found more signs of habitation, makeshift shelters, broken tools, bones some belonging to animals, others uncertain. One site contained an old cooking pot, etched with initials too worn to decipher. It felt endless, like peeling back layers of time that refused to stop giving. Every discovery pushed the mystery farther out, like the forest itself was rewriting its own story as we uncovered it. Then came the item that changed everything, a small metal container found buried near the edge of the Hartman site. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a piece of paper covered in smudged writing. It wasn't Michael's hand. The language was fractured, the ink waterlogged, but one line stood out clear. "They're not gone. They move when the wind stops." Walsh said it could be the product of someone in severe psychological distress, maybe another lost hiker from decades earlier. But the phrasing echoed something from Michael's journal almost word for word. That connection was impossible to ignore. The idea that different people years apart had written the same thought in different hands, that's the part that settled under my skin. By early summer, the site was closed down for good. Too dangerous, they said. Too contaminated for further work. The official report would classify the Hartmans as lost to environmental exposure, presumed deceased. A line that sounded neat on paper, But none of us believed it. The evidence didn't point to death, it pointed to disappearance of another kind. Before she left, Santos handed me a photocopy of the journal's last page. "Keep this," she said. "You knew him better than any of us. Maybe you'll understand what he meant." The handwriting was barely legible. "It's not ending," it read. "It's opening." I've gone back over those words more times than I can count. Sometimes I think he was talking about the forest, how it can consume you, change you, make you part of it. Other times I think he meant something larger, something beyond the reach of what any of us can explain. The last time I stood on that ridge, the light was fading just the same as it had 15 years earlier. The trees leaned close, their tops whispering against one another, and the air carried that damp, metallic scent I'll never forget. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard movement, a low rustle, a branch shifting, but when I turned, nothing was there. Just the stillness. I walked back to the truck in silence. Behind me, the mist was beginning to gather again, curling low along the ground. The kind of mist that hides everything you're not ready to see. And as I started the engine, I realized the mountain hadn't given us answers. It had only invited us to listen. After the site was sealed and the last trucks rolled off the mountain, the forest went quiet again. The tape came down, the markers were pulled, and the Hartman clearing was left to the wind. That's how it should have been, I suppose, the land reclaiming what was always its own. But for those of us who'd been there, something stayed behind. A stillness that followed us home like we'd carried part of the mountain in our pockets without meaning to. The investigation faded slowly the way most long cases do, not with an answer but with fatigue. The official reports used clean words, environmental exposure presumed fatal. The papers said the family had closure, but if you've ever watched a mother bury an empty box, you know that's not what closure looks like. Sarah came to every debrief she was allowed to attend. She sat straight-backed, took notes, and never raised her voice. When they told her the evidence showed her husband and son had survived for years. Maybe 3, maybe more. She just nodded like she'd known all along. Later outside, she told me it was almost worse. "I used to pray they'd gone quick," she said. "But now I know they stayed and they hoped. And that hope must have hurt like hell." After the forest closed, she sold the house on Maple Street. Said the walls had too many echoes. She moved east, somewhere quiet near Spokane, where she works part-time at a small library. She sends Christmas cards every few years, always handwritten, always signed. Peace, not answers. I think she means it. As for the others, Detective Santos took early retirement the following spring. I heard she moved to the coast, still consulting when they asked her to. She and I talked once more before she left. We met for coffee in town, the same diner where Michael used to sit on Fridays with his clipboard and that little half-smile. She slid a small envelope across the table, a photo taken at the site before everything was packed up. Just trees, fog, and a blue scrap of tent still clinging to a fallen branch. "It's strange," she said, staring at the picture. "I spent half my life chasing explanations, but maybe the truth's quieter than that. Maybe it's not what happened to them. Maybe it's what they became part of." Dr. Walsh's report never made it past the second draft. The university claimed insufficient data for publication. She didn't seem surprised. We spoke briefly at a symposium years later. She told me she'd found traces of other encampments even older than the Hartman site, all within that same radius. "Something about those ridges draws people," she said. "Maybe for the isolation, maybe something older than that." Her voice went soft then, and I noticed she avoided saying why. For a while I went back up there alone, not to look for anything, just to see it as it was. The access road washed out one spring, but I knew the old footpath well enough to reach the ridge. The camp was gone by then, reclaimed by moss and soil. The fire ring had collapsed into a mound of stone and ash. Only the carving on the tree remained faint now, almost erased by new growth. I traced it with my fingertips, the letters M and C still visible, stubborn as memory. Around me, the forest sounded alive again. Birds returned. Water ran through the gullies. It felt less like a grave and more like a place that had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. I remember thinking then that maybe survival isn't always the kind we recognize. Michael and Connor didn't make it out, not in the way we understand survival, but they'd built something out there, not just shelter, but endurance. They adapted, learned the rhythms of the land, and lived long after we'd stopped looking. They became part of that mountain's story written in layers of smoke bark and time. Every year or so, hikers still go missing in that region. Most are found within days, cold, hungry, disoriented. But a few aren't. Search teams still mention the Hartmans in briefings, reminding newcomers that nature doesn't negotiate. Sometimes when a rescue drags into its second or third week, I'll get a call from someone asking what I think happened to them, to Michael and Connor. I never give the same answer twice. Sometimes I say they got lost and never found their way out. Sometimes I say they found something they couldn't leave. Depends on who's asking and what they really want to hear. This past spring, I met a new ranger assigned to that district. Young, eager, not yet wary of the job. He said he'd been walking the northern perimeter one morning when he came across a small wooden marker wedged between stones near the creek. Nothing fancy, just a cross made from 2 branches tied with cord. At the base, a small tin tag had been nailed into the wood. The engraving was worn, but he thought he saw letters, M-H and C-H. He asked if I'd placed it there. I hadn't. Sarah hadn't either. Maybe another hiker, maybe a stranger who'd heard the story. Or maybe it had always been there, waiting for someone to notice. After all these years, the part that stays with me isn't the mystery. It's the quiet it left behind. The way the town carried on, new families, new storefronts, a new road where the old one used to flood, and yet whenever fog settles along the ridge, folks still mention the Hartmans. Their story became a kind of caution. Yes, but also a reminder that love can drive people farther into the wilderness than reason ever could, and that sometimes the wild answers back. The night before the memorial service, the one we held 15 years too late, I stood by the water behind the fire station. The lake was still moonlight drifting across it in a soft shimmer. You could almost imagine 2 figures on the opposite shore, one tall, one young, moving between the trees. I don't believe in ghosts, not really, but I believe in echoes, the way certain names refuse to fade, the way certain stories keep breathing through the people who remember them. When Sarah spoke at the service, she didn't read from a note. She just said, they loved the outdoors. I hope they found peace where they were happiest. That was it. No sermon, no anger, no plea for closure. Just the kind of quiet love that doesn't need proof, the kind that endures. Sometimes I still drive the old county road at dusk just to see the mountains catch the last light. There's a turn where the pavement narrows and the tree line presses close, and every time I pass it I feel that same small pull, a weight and a calm all at once. I think about Michael and Connor, about what they might have seen, about how close beauty and danger can live to each other. The mountain hasn't changed. It never does. But I think I have. I used to think the truth was something you could find if you searched hard enough, like a missing person or a trail you just hadn't seen yet. Now I'm not so sure. Maybe some truths aren't meant to be solved. Maybe they're meant to be carried gently, honestly, as reminders of where we've been and of the people who walked a little too far trying to find their way home. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.